Hey, blessings, grace, and peace, connected church, teammates, supporters, friends. Welcome to the Connected Podcast. This is Charles Botts. I am the founder and pastor here at My Connected Church. Our website is myconnectedchurch.com, and we are thrilled that you would once again download and listen to our weekly Bible study, the Connected Podcast. We are concluding a 5-week series on the Megaloth, the volumes, a 5-book collection of works found in the Jewish scrolls, what we refer to as the Old Testament. And over the last 5 weeks, we have been walking through and examining these 5 books that make up the volumes or the Megaloth and the celebrations, the holidays that these particular books are associated with. And we bring it to a conclusion this week. As you may recall, we started this journey way back looking at the book of Ruth. And Ruth was actually associated with Pentecost. And so we started with Ruth, and then we went on to Esther and Purim. From there, we went on to Song of Songs, and what is Passover. Passover is associated with the Song of Songs, and then we went into Lamentations, and Lamentations is associated with the holiday of the ninth Av, AV, which is recognition, remembrance of the loss of the first and second temples. And then Ecclesiastes is what we're going to be wrapping up with in today's Bible study. And Ecclesiastes is associated with the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. And so here we are, and excited again to have this conversation with you and share this Bible study with you. So the Feast of Booths comes from the Hebrew word Sukkoth or Sukkos. The singular is Sukkah. It's the Feast of Tabernacles. It's a Jewish autumn festival. It's like a Thanksgiving of sorts. It's 5 days after Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, and it's related to one of the 3 pilgrim festivals is the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles, when grains and fruits were gathered at the end of the harvest, and that end of the harvest season was celebrated by the Feast of Booths, recalling the days in particular where Israel lived out of huts, lived out of booths or tents, tabernacles, which are called Sukkots, while they were wandering in the wilderness after having been freed from captivity and escaped the bondage in Egypt. And so during that time, they wandered for 40 years and lived out of tabernacles, lived out of tents or booths. And so a Sukkoth is, or the Feast of Sukkoth, or the Feast of Booths, is in celebration of that. And so it is interesting then that Ecclesiastes would be associated with that particular celebration, that a book that describes all as vanity, as chasing after wind, would be associated with a celebration of the end of harvest season and the remembrance of when Israel lived out of tents. And I think it actually is quite apt. I think it makes perfect sense when you consider that Solomon's big takeaway, Solomon's big aha moment in Ecclesiastes, and while there is some debate as to whether or not Solomon actually put ink to scroll, if you will, in terms of actually writing Ecclesiastes, much of the wisdom and the structure is certainly attributed to Solomon, even if someone else actually physically wrote it. Much of what is found in Ecclesiastes, there's general good consensus that it came from Solomon, and so what Solomon is discussing, and we'll look at it a bit deeper. But again, the overall conclusion is that striving after stuff, striving after material gain in the world is vanity. It's chasing after wind. It's all vapor and breath, and you can't hold it. And Israel wandered for 40 years because they did not accept the word of the Lord that said, I have delivered the land of Canaan into your hands. Remember, if you recall, Moses sent 12 spies to spy out the land of Jericho, the entrance to the promised land, and 10 came back with a very negative report. 2 affirmed the word of the Lord, Caleb and Joshua. The other 10 reported great fear, were quoted as saying, there are giants in the land and we look like grasshoppers in their eyes. Now here's the real irony of that. We read 40 years later when Joshua then sends 2 spies into the promised land. Interesting that Joshua only sends 2, right? Moses sent 12. 2 came back with a positive report. So Joshua, being one of those 2 the first time around, then ends up sending 2 himself, I think, to sort of capture that notion. Why do I need to send 12 if 2 are going to be the ones that affirm the word of the Lord? Let me just send those 2 to affirm the word of the Lord, and let's be done with this. So that's kind of interesting to kind of play and chew on that notion, the significance of the 2, and most assuredly, one of the 2 was Caleb again. There is some pretty good consensus in theological circles that Caleb was sent back by Joshua because Joshua knew, again, that Caleb was going to stand on the word of the Lord. And so what happens when the spies sneak into Jericho and they end up in Rahab's house? Rahab says, we have heard of the fame of Israel and the living God and how your God delivered you from Egypt. And so there was this reputation, and you have to believe that reputation didn't just start then. That reputation has been growing for some time. So the irony is the 10 that, and we're getting a little bit off topic, but this Bible study, right? We can dig deep. We can dive a little bit deeper here. So the 10, ironically enough, go and they see themselves as grasshoppers in the eyes of individuals whom they perceive to be giants. And the reality is that those inhabitants of Jericho saw the Israelites as giants. And so this is why then Solomon, some 100 more years later, 1,000 or more years later, can turn around and say that it's all vapor. That the Israelites had no faith. They saw themselves as insects in the eyes of giants, and the inhabitants of Jericho saw themselves as insects in the eyes of the giants of Israel. And so Solomon said, and so that then sets Israel on this path of wandering for 40 years. They don't have the faith to take the Lord at the Lord's word, and so they end up wandering 40 years in the wilderness, living out of tents. A very nomadic people living out of tents, being fed by manna, and water out of rock, and complaining every step of the way, because they missed the what they perceived as the luxuries of slavery. They missed meat in Egypt. They missed the comfort of what they knew. They missed the comfort of the familiar. And so then the notion that to be wandering the wilderness, living out of these tents, when you come to the end of harvest, I think Ecclesiastes is an elegant reminder yet that while this food is very important, remember it was not that long ago, Israel, that you were not in the promised land. And so do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought to think, and do not forget, O Israel, that you put too much emphasis on the harvest. It is vapor, it is passing. You grow food today, you eat it, you consume, and there's nothing left for tomorrow. And so then you have to go back into the toil. You have to go back into the work. And that is one of Solomon's big themes, is this idea of working and toiling, and it really not serving the purpose of the individual that's doing all the toil, that's doing all the labor, because ultimately they work so hard, they die, they take nothing with them, and they have to leave it as an inheritance to their children that did not work for it the way that they worked for it, and so therefore won't value it the same way, and then so therefore all is vapor, all is mist, is just wind. And so I think, that is an elegant connection to see how the celebration of booths, the celebration or the Feast of Tabernacles, that Ecclesiastes would be a part of that as a reminder. Let's not get so wrapped up, let's not get so caught up in these things that we forget what's most important. And that is much of what the preacher, Solomon, or the preacher character, as described in Ecclesiastes, that's a large part of the message of the preacher. We look at in chapter 2, yea, I hated all my labor, which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that be after me. And who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool? Yet shall he have rule over all my labor, wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun. This is vanity. It's verse 18 and 19 in chapter 2. So Solomon, again, is not saying don't leave an inheritance, but he's making the point that there's little reward in that workaholic spirit. There's little reward in this notion of working yourself to the bone to acquire some sort of material wealth when you're neglecting the things of God, when you're neglecting the things of eternity. That it is vapor, it is passing wind, to strive after those things. If we look at verse 26, for to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This is also vanity, and striving after wind. So again, you work so hard, and if you don't put the proper proper emphasis, proper priorities on the proper tasks, it is vapor. It is passing or striving. Chapter 3 begins with, I think, one of the more famous passages in all of Scripture, starting with verse 1, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, to pluck up that which has been planted. Verse 3, a time to kill, to heal, to break down, to build up, to weep, to laugh, to mourn, to dance, to cast away stones, to gather stones together, to embrace, to refrain from embracing, to seek, to lose, to keep, to cast away, to tear, to sow, to keep silent, to speak, to love, to hate, for war and for peace. Just such profound insight and wisdom, and I think a reminder that the season you're in is not permanent. It's not a permanent state. And I think it's very easy when things are great or when things are not to just get this sense that it's always going to be this way. And Solomon is reflecting from the perspective of someone. You may have heard me share this on Sunday if you haven't had a chance to download and listen to this past Sunday's Sunday sessions from September 26th. This past Sunday sessions. I really want to encourage you to download that and give it a listen. Part of what I preached Sunday was this notion that Solomon had it all in terms of what we would consider, success or living that best life, right? Solomon was living his best life. Not only was he incredibly wealthy, he was famous. But not only was he famous, he wasn't famous, because he was a ditz or famous for famous sake or famous because his daddy had money. Solomon was famous and wealthy because of his wisdom, because of his intellect. Of all the ways to be wealthy, that's the way to do it. And because of his wealth and because of his fame, he also was not really spared any pleasures of the flesh. We know his reputation, the number, so many hundreds of wives and concubines, and whether that number is exact or not. I mean, the reality is that whatever impulse that Solomon wanted to give into, he could. That there was nothing that would be kept from him, and he even describes that there was very little that he kept from himself. There's very little he didn't engage in because it was all there. It was all available, and again at the end, it's still vanity. It was still vanity because there is a time and a season. And so reflecting back, I imagine that Solomon, in the moment of the height of his wealth and fame and prosperity, that he felt like it would last always. And as he comes to the end of his life, he realizes that eternity is the only thing that lasts always. That in this dimension, in this plane, there are seasons and times, and we are not to forget that. He goes on in chapter 4 to walk us through some of his learnings and this notion that what happens under the sun is consistent. That there are no surprises. There are no surprises for God, and good and bad alike. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 1. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. I mean, just, where do you, how far must you have fallen to be Solomon and to have that sense of hopelessness to look around and to see power abused and just feel utterly depressed and incapable of doing anything. Then I saw the toil and all the skin and work came from man's envy of his neighbor. This is also vanity and a striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 handfuls of toil and striving after wind. Again, I saw vanity under the sun. what is the point of oppressing your neighbor, your brother? What is the point of exercising a power unrighteously for gain that will not last? For gain that will not last. And so important to consider that and to ponder that and to evaluate where you are. Where are you in? What season are you in your life? What season of life are you in right now? Are you in a season of great prosperity? Are you in a season of great lack? Are you in a season of abundant health? Are you in a season of illness? Are you in a season of fulfilling relationships? Are you in a season of lack of fulfillment in relationships? Are you in a season of contributing? Are you in a season of taking? And recognize that whatever season you are in, it will not last. That times and seasons change. The one constant in life, we've heard this before. You've heard this cliche before. The one constant in life is that things change. Things change. Solomon goes on in chapter 4, a bit of a departure. We see in verses 9 and 12, he talks about the advantages of not going through life or individual situations alone. Two are better than one. Because they have a good reward in their labor, a threefold cord is not easily broken. That's verse 9, and then again, verse 12. We aren't meant to be alone. We aren't meant to, and I think that's particularly important when we think about prosperity, when we think about what we value and how to reach goals. And this notion of I did it on my own, bootstrap, no help, no all me, is a fairy tale notion. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Even I was listening to a podcast earlier in the week, and they were talking about the founders of Hobby Lobby, the Green family, and in particular, the husband and wife, Mr. and Mrs. Green. I can't remember their first names right now. But Mr. Green, comes from a family of preachers. I think there's 5 children. The other 4 are preachers, and Mr. Green is the sole entrepreneur, and just clearly created to be an entrepreneur. He grew up and was, I think, maybe like the youngest general manager of a thrift store. In his region, in his area, and goes on, and he and his wife take out a $600 loan from the bank to build their custom frame business out of their home, and they take that and they buy a small retail store there in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and Hobby Lobby is born. His parents didn't come from money. He didn't have as far as we could tell, an angel investor. Sort of that notion of he really kind of, again, quote unquote, built it, or they built it on their own. The reality is that's not entirely accurate. I mean, he did get a loan. He got access to capital that he didn't have on his own, and I would be hard pressed to believe that the management decisions and the strategies and the techniques that were utilized in order for Hobby Lobby to grow to a $5 billion global business did not happen without others making significant contributions. And so again, we just go back to this notion that we're not meant to be alone. We're not meant to be alone. Chapter 5, the author takes a bit of a pivot and returns to advising and encouraging, very similar to what we've found in Proverbs. Here the preacher is admonishing the reader to be careful when they enter God's house, that they should be ready to listen and not rush into giving foolish sacrifices. That we would do well to remember our faith increases as we hear the word of God. We see that in Romans chapter 10, verse 17. It's important and necessary to bring offerings, bring a sacrifice of praise and gifts to the Lord. But it's more about what we hear. Look at chapter 5, verse 5. Better it is that thou shouldest not vow than that thou shouldest vow and not pay. At verse 9, moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. There's nothing that the earth yields that we don't have a right to. Even kings are served by what comes out of the earth. There's that notion, that great equalizer of time. Doesn't matter how much money you have, how little money you have, doesn't matter how tall, how fast, how strong, how weak. Everybody's got 24 hours in a day. Wealthiest man in the world hasn't figured out how to add more time to the day. We are all fed by this earth. You're the wealthiest person in the world. Their food doesn't come from somewhere else. They're not importing food from Mars that I know of. They're not importing food from Mercury that I'm aware of. The earth sustains us all, kings and commoners, and I think that's crucial. That's crucial to remember. And in our striving, in our working, that you are as much the righteousness of God. You are as much the image of God as anyone else. Comparison is so dangerous. It's so dangerous to find your worth, to find your value in others. It's so dangerous to look to others and to see their success and see their prosperity, and define yourself based on where they are and what they're doing. And that's a mistake. That's a mistake. We are all created in the image and likeness of our God. We are all fed and sustained by this earth. We are all bound by the dimension, the construct of time. And those are things that are true for all of us. And we should not forget it. So as we wrap up and come to a close for this week, I think there's a couple things that I want to leave us with. Chapter 7, verse 1: a good name is better than precious ointment. Not a lot of confusion there. Solomon is reminding us of what's important, of what's key. If we look at chapter 8, it is Solomon imploring us to consider those things that go beyond material possession, that go beyond material or earthly gain. Because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry, for that shall abide with him of his labor the days of his life, which God had given him under the sun. This idea of eating and drinking and being merry only comes when you've completed your work. If you don't work, you don't eat. That we see that in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 10. Proverbs, Solomon reiterates that notion in Proverbs. Consider the ant. You lazy fool, how the ant works to store up in the fall so that it has food in the winter. Chapter 9, wisdom is better than weapons of war. That's in verse 18 of chapter 9. But in verse 11 we also see, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill. But time and chance happens to them all. We want to be careful, because while we don't prescribe to chance, right? Nothing happens by chance. Nothing happens by coincidence. What Solomon is saying here, and this goes back to when we preached on that notion of sort of Calvinism and predestination, this idea that, is my life my life? And there's a path. There's a path that God has prescribed for us all. Is working hard important? Absolutely. Is killing ourselves, is working to the bone, striving after some sort of material gain because we want to live in this prosperity? No, that is foolishness. That's foolishness. That's striving after. That's vanity of vanities. Is trying to will yourself to a place beyond what God has designed and purposed. That is a mistake. That's an error. And particularly to do it over something as silly as material gain that will not last, that has no permanence at all. And so, Solomon then in the last 3 chapters, 10, 11, and 12, returns to the notion of vanity and striving after wind, and then concludes it. And we did this Sunday, but it is worth reiterating. Verse 14 wraps up the whole thing. This is the final truth in the final verse of this book. For God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. And so what does he say at the end of the whole matter? When it's all said and done, that what it comes down to is to love God, and to keep His commandments. The wise words, verse 11. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are collected sayings that are given by one shepherd. My son, be aware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Verse 13, here it is. The end of all matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. And that is the conclusion to the matter, family. That is it in its entirety. Is what are we to do? What is our example? To love God, to keep His commandments, because it's all going to be judged. And you do not want to be guilty of striving after vanity. You want to be striving after the things of eternity. I'm so grateful for your joining us for one more week for a Bible study here at the Connected Podcast. Please rate, review, and share. That is how the word gets out. Don't keep this good word to yourself. Share this word. Let this word get out and be a blessing to someone else. Family, we really do appreciate you. We appreciate your support and everything that you do. As we often say, it is never a cliche. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay in this fight. God bless, fam. Take care.